The German columns moved east in the autumn mud, steel tracks clattering, engines coughing through a haze of exhaust. In the lead was Colonel Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg machine. Moscow lay only a few hundred kilometers ahead, the road seemingly open. After 4 months of victories, Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, the pattern felt certain. The Red Army broke, the Panzers advanced, and the Third Reich's banners followed. It was October 6, 1941, near the town of Mtsensk. The advance guard of the 4th Panzer Division pushed along the Ural-Tula road, Panzer IIIs and IVs grinding forward. Their crews had been told that Soviet tanks were obsolete, poorly armoured relics, little more than rolling coffins. The German door-knockers, 37mm and 50mm guns, had so far seemed enough. Then the ground shifted. From the tree line came a different machine, a dark, squat tank with sharply angled armour and a gun thicker than any the Panzer crews had faced, the Soviet T-34. Lieutenant Hans Rudel of the 35th Panzer Regiment recalled the moment in his diary. They came out of the woods not like prey, but like hunters. We fired. Our 50mm shells glanced off like pebbles. The T-34s returned fire, and one panzer after another was struck, burning. It was as if we were facing tanks from another world. The German gunners fired frantically, their 50mm KWK-38 shells ricocheting from the T-34's sloped glacis. Panzer III and IV crews had relied on manoeuvre, flanking and superior optics, but here even point-blank fire seemed useless. Soviet shells, 76.2mm high-velocity rounds, punched clean through German armour. The battle near Mtsensk saw Major General Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade ambush the German spearhead with fewer than 200 T-34s and KV-1s. In hours, Katukov's men halted the advance of an entire Panzer Division. Guderian's own reports noted with alarm, "Our panzer attacks near Mtsensk were repulsed with heavy losses by Soviet T-34 tanks. The Russian T-34 is a superb weapon. It possesses firepower, mobility, and armour protection far superior to our tanks." Before June 1941, German intelligence assessments had dismissed Soviet armour. Reports filed to OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, claimed the Red Army fielded mostly light tanks, derivatives of foreign designs. No mention was made of a medium tank with diesel power, sloped armour, and a high-velocity cannon. The shock at Mtsensk revealed a failure not just of intelligence, but of imagination. The T-34's 45mm of sloped armour provided effective resistance equivalent to 75mm of flat plate. Its wide tracks gave it mobility across the mud where German machines bogged down. The 500-horsepower Phi-2 diesel engine, unlike German gasoline motors, reduced fire risk and extended operational range. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Noller, Panzer commander, described the disbelief. "We were told the Russians had nothing. Then suddenly there was this tank, faster, better armoured, better armed. Our shells simply bounced. It was a nightmare." Captured Soviet tank crews, interrogated by the 13th Army Corps in October 1941, explained the T-34's origins. One driver, Ivan Petrovich Kuznetsov, said, "We built this machine for the mud. The Germans thought of roads. We thought of fields, snow, rivers. The armour was angled so your shells would slide off. Our gun was made to smash through your tanks before they came near." Another prisoner, gunner Alexei Mikhailov, stated, "We trained to keep moving, never stop. The tank was not just for battle but for survival, fuel for days, able to fight in winter. We knew the Germans would come fast. We had to be faster where it mattered." Their words aligned with Soviet design philosophy under Chief Engineer Mikhail Koshkin. Build a tank that could operate in the harshest Russian conditions, survive German shells, and strike with overwhelming firepower. For the Panzer crews at Mtsensk, the clash with T-34s was more than a tactical defeat. It was the shattering of an illusion. German doctrine rested on the assumption of technological superiority, that training, precision and superior weapons would compensate for numbers. At Mtsensk, those assumptions burned in the wrecks of Panzer IIIs and IVs smouldering along the roadside. The Germans had no adequate anti-tank weapon in 1941 capable of reliably defeating the T-34. The famous 88mm gun, deadly in direct fire, was scarce and cumbersome to reposition in fast-moving battles. Field artillery struggled with mobility. Infantry anti-tank rifles were useless. The shock was so severe that within weeks, German engineers began urgent projects for new tanks, what would become the Panther and the Tiger. Both would borrow design lessons directly from the T-34, sloped armour, wide tracks, high-velocity guns. Post-war interrogations add further testimony. General Hoth later admitted, "We underestimated Russian industry and Russian design. The T-34 was a complete surprise, and it changed the way we thought about the entire campaign." German soldiers captured in late 1941 repeatedly described morale collapsing upon the appearance of T-34s. One infantryman recounted, "We called our 37mm guns door knockers. Against the Russian tanks they were nothing. We fired and they came closer, still firing. Many men broke and ran." The battle near Mtsensk did not decide the war. The Panzer Divisions eventually resumed their advance, Moscow still in their sights. But something irreversible had happened. German crews had seen, with their own eyes, that the Soviet Union could produce a tank that outran and outgunned the best the Reich could field. The myth of German invincibility cracked. The T-34 was not merely another tank. It was a philosophy rendered in steel, simplicity over complexity, mass production over perfection, mobility over polish. It was designed not for show but for survival, not for parades but for mud, snow and attrition. At Mtsensk, German tankers learned that their blitzkrieg machine had met its match. For the first time since 1939, the Panzer spearhead had not broken through. Instead, it recoiled. In the fields near Mtsensk, after the smoke cleared, German officers inspected the battlefield. Dozens of Panzer wrecks lay scattered, their thin armour ripped open by Soviet shells. Amid them stood hulking T-34s, many still operational despite multiple hits. One German engineer ran his hands over the sloped armour plates, muttering in disbelief. Another measured the thickness and shook his head. The verdict was already clear. The Panzer crews had never expected to meet a machine that could not only survive their fire, but hunt them with impunity. At Mtsensk in October 1941, the T-34 announced itself, not as a rumour, but as a revolution. The Germans at Mtsensk were not facing a battlefield accident. The T-34 was not a desperate improvisation, but the product of a deliberate Soviet gamble taken years earlier, when war with Germany was still only a possibility. It began not on the battlefield, but in a design bureau in Kharkov in 1937. Mikhail Koshkin, chief designer at the Kharkov Comintern locomotive plant, inherited a family of fast, lightly armoured BT tanks based on American engineer J. Walter Christie's suspension system. The BTS could run fast on roads, but in the mud of Russia they bogged down and burned easily. Koshkin's mandate was radical: create a medium tank that could outfight anything the Germans had and survive in the mud, snow and ice of the Soviet Union. His team drafted a design with three decisive features: sloped armour, 45mm plates angled at 60 degrees, giving the effective protection of 75mm of vertical steel. A diesel engine, the V2, 500 horsepower, less flammable than German gasoline motors. A high-velocity gun, initially the L1176.2mm cannon, able to punch through contemporary Panzer armour at combat ranges. In 1939, Koshkin drove two prototypes, one called A-20, the other A-32, across 1,800 kilometres from Kharkov to Moscow to prove their endurance. Stalin himself reviewed the project. The A-32 was approved and refined into the production T-34. Koshkin, ill from pneumonia contracted during the test drive, did not live to see it enter service. Pre-war German intelligence dismissed Soviet armour as obsolete. In 1940, Abwehr estimates suggested that the Red Army fielded thousands of light tanks, the T-26 and BT series, but nothing that could rival German Panzer III or IV designs. When Wehrmacht officers toured Soviet industry under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they were shown only outdated models. Oberst Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, assured Hitler, "The Russian tank industry is backward. They have nothing that can withstand our 37mm and 50mm guns." In truth, Soviet factories at Kharkov and Stalingrad were already tooling up for mass production of a machine the Germans had not even imagined. By June 1941, more than 1,000 T-34s were already in service. When captured intact, T-34s were sent back to the German test ground at Kummersdorf in late 1941. Engineers documented the features with disbelief. Reports highlighted armour. German 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns were useless. Only the 88mm flak gun could consistently penetrate. Mobility. The Christie suspension allowed high speed across rough terrain. Panzer III top speed in mud, 15 km per hour. T-34, 25 km per hour. Tracks. T-34 track width, 550 mm, double the German standard. This spread weight over mud and snow, where panzers bogged down. Gun. The 76.2 mm could penetrate a Panzer III frontally at over 1,000 metres. German 50mm guns required flanking shots at under 500 metres. One German engineer concluded, "This tank is the best in the world. It combines protection, firepower and mobility in a manner we never attempted." Post-war interrogations confirm the intent behind these design choices. Engineer Alexander Morozov, who worked under Koshkin, stated in 1945, "The T-34 was not meant for parades. It was built for Russian roads, that is to say, no roads at all. Armour must be angled because steel was scarce. Diesel was chosen because we knew gasoline would burn in the cold and in battle. Every bolt, every weld was chosen for war in the East, not for the salons of Europe." Soviet tanker Ivan Shmelyov later recalled, "We laughed at the Germans when their tanks sank in the mud. Ours kept moving. The T-34 was not comfortable, not beautiful, but it kept moving. That is all we asked." The emergence of the T-34 revealed a fundamental difference in German and Soviet design philosophy. German approach, precision engineering, modular designs, incremental upgrades, limited production runs. Tanks built like fine instruments. Soviet approach, rugged simplicity, ease of manufacture, designs optimized for the harshest terrain. Tanks built like farm tools, repairable in a field workshop with a hammer. The numbers tell the story. In 1941, Germany produced fewer than 3,000 tanks. The Soviet Union, despite losing Kharkov and Stalingrad factories to invasion, relocated industry eastward and still produced over 4,000 T-34s that year. The German crews who faced them first believed they were encountering a rare elite model. By 1942, they realized it was becoming the standard Soviet tank. General Heinz Guderian, shaken by Mtsensk, pressed Berlin for immediate answers. The appearance of the Russian T-34 requires urgent measures. It is proof that the Russians have tanks that are technically superior to our best types. German High Command ordered emergency upgrades. The Panzer IV received the long-barreled 75mm KWK-40, and entirely new designs, the Panther and Tiger, were rushed into development. Yet these would not reach the battlefield in meaningful numbers until 1943. For 2 years, German panzer crews were forced to fight a superior enemy with inferior machines. At Mtsensk, the T-34 appeared to the Germans as if it had emerged from nowhere. but it was the product of years of Soviet planning, built for a war of attrition and geography. It was the machine the Germans never expected, the tank that defied their assumptions about superiority. The myth of the unstoppable Panzer was already cracking. Soviet armour had not only survived the blitzkrieg, it had begun to turn it back. The encounter at Mtsensk was more than a clash of machines. It was a clash of tactics, assumptions, and battlefield psychology. For German panzer crews who had raced across Poland and France, accustomed to outmanoeuvring slower, weaker armour, the T-34 was not only a technical shock, it was a tactical nightmare. On October 6, 1941, near the small city of Mtsensk, Colonel Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade staged one of the first coordinated Soviet armoured ambushes of the war. The brigade had fewer than 60 tanks, but among them were the new T-34s and KV-1 heavy tanks. German records from the 4th Panzer Division describe the scene. The panzers advanced in column formation along a narrow road screened by infantry. Soviet scouts had marked the route. At dawn, concealed T-34s opened fire from wooded positions, their 76.2mm guns knocking out the lead and trailing German vehicles. The column was trapped. Oberleutnant Hermann Weidmann, a Panzer III commander, later wrote in his diary, captured in 1942, "We fired and fired, but the shells bounced off their sloped armour like stones off a wall. Our comrades burned, yet the Russian tanks kept coming, moving in mud where we could not follow." Within hours, Guderian's spearhead had lost dozens of vehicles. The Soviets disengaged before being overwhelmed, but the damage was done. The myth of German invincibility had cracked. The tactical mismatch was stark. Panzer III Ausführung, H, 1941. 50mm KWK, 38 gun, effective penetration approximately 40mm at 500 metres. Against a T-34's 45mm sloped armour, it was almost useless. Panzer IV, short-barreled 75mm. Designed for infantry support, effective against bunkers, but poor armour penetration. T-34, 76.2mm, F-34 gun. Could penetrate the frontal armour of Panzer 3 or 4 at 1,000 metres. German anti-tank guns fared no better. The standard 37mm Pak-36, nicknamed the Door Knocker, Heeresanklopfgerät, by frustrated crews, could not penetrate the T-34 at all. Even the 50mm Pak-38 struggled unless at point-blank range. Only the 88mm flak, cumbersome and rare in the field, offered consistent results. At Mtsensk, German commanders realized they were deploying weapons designed for the last war against a machine designed for the next. General Heinz Guderian's after-action report, filed October 1941, is preserved in the Bundesarchive. It reads like a confession. "The Russian T-34 is a tank against which our weapons are at present ineffective. Our panzers must approach to 50 metres or less to have any chance of success. Even then, their mobility in terrain is far superior. They fight as if immune to the terrain that bogs down our forces." Guderian pressed for urgent measures, new tank guns, new anti-tank weapons, and above all, new designs. But he acknowledged this would take years. In the short term, German doctrine would have to adapt. German units improvised. Tactics shifted from armoured thrusts to combined arms engagements, calling artillery and Stuka dive bombers against T-34 concentrations. Anti-aircraft guns were redeployed for ground fire. Infantry was trained to use shaped charge explosives, though these were scarce in 1941. Tank crews developed desperation tactics, aiming at tracks to immobilize T-34s, calling in engineers with explosives, or coordinating massed fire from multiple vehicles. Yet these measures revealed the strategic imbalance. The Germans were reacting, not dictating. The Soviets, too, were learning. Early T-34 crews suffered from poor training and lack of coordination. Radios were scarce. Many tanks relied on signal flags. At Mtsensk, Katukov's brigade was exceptional, a commander who grasped the T-34's strengths and exploited German weaknesses. Captured Soviet tankers later explained their methods. A debriefing in November 1941 recorded one prisoner saying, "We did not meet the Germans in the open. We waited in cover, in woods or hills, and let them come. The T-34 can shoot further and move on bad ground. We fought them like hunters, not like boxers." This philosophy of ambush and counterattack, combined with the tank's technical advantages, allowed small Soviet units to hold off superior German forces. The psychological effect on German troops was immediate. Rumours spread that the Soviets had an invincible tank. Morale wavered among Panzer divisions accustomed to rapid victories. Hitler himself, briefed on the T-34 in November 1941, reportedly raged at his generals. "Why was I not told of this before?" German propaganda minimized the problem, but in internal memoranda, panic was evident. Orders went out for new tank designs: the Panther, modelled directly on the T-34's sloped armour, and the Tiger, designed to crush it with overwhelming firepower. Both would not appear in numbers until 1943. For the winter of 1941, German crews had no choice but to fight in machines they knew were inferior. The tactical shock at Mtsensk exposed the fragility of German assumptions. The Wehrmacht had believed speed, coordination and experience would always overcome Soviet resistance. But the T-34 overturned that calculation. It was a machine built for the environment, for the mud and snow, and it gave the Red Army a weapon that could meet the Germans on equal terms. The lesson was stark. German technological superiority was not guaranteed. The Soviets had caught them unprepared, and the battlefield was no longer theirs alone. What began at Mtsensk was not an isolated event. It was the opening act in a long struggle where German crews would confront, again and again, the reality that the T-34 could not only resist them, but outfight them. The battlefield shock of October 1941 set the stage for a war of attrition Germany had not planned to fight, a war in which the T-34 would become the central symbol of Soviet resilience and industrial might. By late October 1941, as German tanks ground through the mud toward Moscow, the reality of the T-34 had sunk deep into Panzer divisions. The Wehrmacht had expected the Red Army to collapse quickly. Instead, they were discovering that not only were Soviet troops willing to fight on, but they possessed a weapon perfectly adapted to the conditions in which the Germans now struggled. The autumn rains turned Russia's roads into rivers of mud. German panzers, with their narrow tracks, sank deep, bogging down in every village and forest track. Entire columns had to halt while tractors were brought forward to tow immobilized tanks. The Panzer III and IV, with engines overworked from months of campaigning, overheated and broke down. The T-34, by contrast, thrived. Its Christie suspension and wide tracks distributed weight evenly, allowing it to glide over terrain where German armour floundered. Soviet memoirs are full of recollections of T-34s passing bogged-down German columns, firing at will before slipping away. Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, serving on Guderian's staff, later wrote, "The T-34 was a tank for Russia. It was as if the very soil had conspired to create it. Where our machines became helpless prisoners of the mud, the Russian tank manoeuvred as if on dry roads." The lesson was plain. German doctrine had emphasized rapid mechanized advances along road networks. In Russia, roads ceased to exist in the autumn. The T-34 made the terrain itself a Soviet ally. When snow fell in late November, another set of problems emerged. German armour, designed for the relatively mild climate of Western Europe, struggled in temperatures plunging to -30 degrees Celsius. Engines refused to start. Fuel thickened in lines. Lubricants froze. Crews, lacking winter clothing, wrapped themselves in stolen blankets and straw. The T-34 was engineered with Russia's winters in mind. Its diesel engine was more reliable in freezing conditions than German gasoline engines. Crews could start engines with compressed air systems even in deep cold. Soviet designers had placed great emphasis on ruggedness and simplicity. The T-34 required fewer delicate adjustments than German tanks. In December, as Soviet counterattacks began outside Moscow, German tankers found themselves facing not just enemy fire, but a mechanical war they were losing. A report from the 2nd Panzer Army, dated January 1942, compiled dozens of field testimonies. Our shells ricochet unless at suicide range. The T-34 crosses snow drifts where our tanks sink. Engines fail in the morning cold. We strike them with hammers to loosen frozen parts. One Panzer IV commander recalled, "We saw them come across the fields, firing as they moved. We could not pursue. Our machines were frozen in place, like statues." German superiority in training and combined arms tactics still won battles, but the margin of technical advantage had disappeared. The T-34 forced the Germans to expend more resources, more ingenuity, and more blood. The Red Army's winter counter-offensive in December 1941 was piecemeal and costly, but the T-34 was at its heart. Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Brigade, the same that had bloodied Guderian at Mtsensk, spearheaded assaults west of Moscow. German soldiers noted with alarm that Soviet industry was already fielding more of the new tanks. Every week, more T-34s appeared, fresh from factories evacuated east of the Urals, beyond Luftwaffe reach. The Germans, by contrast, had no new designs in the field, only incremental modifications to existing Panzer models. Captured German reports describe an almost superstitious awe. One staff officer in Army Group Center wrote in December, "The T-34 appears everywhere. Destroy one and another comes. It is as if the enemy has an endless supply." This was not illusion. It was the first glimpse of Soviet industrial recovery, one that would overwhelm Germany in the years ahead. Desperate measures emerged. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun became the standard counter to T-34s, deployed in ground role whenever available. Stukas with armor-piercing bombs were called upon constantly. Infantry received Panzerbuchse 1939 anti-tank rifles, but these were useless against the T-34's armor except at rear or side angles. By early 1942, the Germans began to rush new weapons to the front. The 75mm Pak-40 anti-tank gun, the Marder series of tank destroyers, and upgrades to Panzer IVs with longer-barreled 75mm guns. But at Mtsensk and through the first winter, these were not yet available in numbers. German soldiers had to endure a period when the battlefield equation favored the Soviets. The shock went deeper than tactical or technical adjustments. It touched morale. German propaganda had promised easy victory, declaring Soviet tanks obsolete. Now, Panzer crews whispered about the T-34 with respect, even fear. Letters home reveal the tone. A corporal in the 18th Panzer Division wrote in December 1941, "They told us Russia had nothing modern. But we face a tank we cannot kill, one that moves like a wolf through snow. We no longer believe what we are told." The aura of German superiority, so central to Blitzkrieg's success, was fractured. Even when the Germans held ground, they understood they faced an enemy whose technology had leapt ahead of theirs in crucial areas. The winter battles of 1941–42 established the central theme that would dominate the Eastern Front: Germany's tactical brilliance versus Soviet material and design resilience. The T-34 was not just another weapon. It symbolized a war that would not be won quickly nor cheaply. For German commanders, the lesson was bitter. Guderian himself admitted in his memoirs, "The shock of Mtsensk was not only that the T-34 was superior, but that we had not foreseen it. In war, surprise in weapons is as deadly as surprise in battle." As the snows of early 1942 blanketed the front, German tankers faced a truth that could not be ignored. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. The winter of 1941–42 had exposed the German Wehrmacht to a new reality. Blitzkrieg had stalled, Moscow remained out of reach, and the myth of German armoured supremacy lay shattered in the snow. The T-34 had revealed not just a tactical advantage, but a strategic one. Soviet industry, though battered, was capable of producing a war-winning machine. The year 1942 would become a contest not only of armies, but of factories. In the autumn of 1941, as German forces drove deep into Soviet territory, Stalin ordered an industrial exodus unprecedented in history. Hundreds of factories, along with their workers, were dismantled and transported eastward, beyond the Ural Mountains to Siberia and Kazakhstan. Machine tools, blueprints, and entire production lines were loaded onto trains and hauled thousands of kilometers. The scale defied imagination. Between October 1941 and February 1942, more than 1,500 industrial enterprises were moved. Among them was the Kharkov locomotive plant, birthplace of the T-34, now reassembled in Nizhny Tagil. Despite chaos and privation, production resumed within months. American observers, writing in the 1945 U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, later noted, "No industrial relocation on such a scale has ever been attempted in history, let alone under the pressure of advancing armies. That it succeeded is a testament to Soviet organizational will." By the spring of 1942, new T-34s were rolling off assembly lines in the east, even as German Panzer Divisions struggled to replace losses. Germany faced the opposite problem. Hitler had gambled on a short war. German industry was not mobilized for prolonged conflict. In 1941, tank production stood at just 3,256 vehicles, barely sufficient to replace losses, let alone expand. The German armament system was fractured, with multiple firms competing for contracts and resources spread across dozens of designs. The Panzer III and IV remained the mainstay, even though commanders knew they were inadequate against the T-34. General Oberst Heinz Guderian pressed Berlin for an urgent solution. A new medium tank with sloped armour and a long 75mm gun. Upgraded Panzer IVs with high-velocity weapons. Mass production rather than boutique engineering. But German industry moved slowly, hampered by bureaucracy and Hitler's erratic demands. Plans for the Panther tank began in 1942, explicitly modelled on the T-34, but it would not reach the front until mid-1943. In the meantime, German crews had to make do with stopgap solutions. Throughout 1942, the Wehrmacht fielded ad hoc weapons to counter the T-34. Marder 1/2/3 tank destroyers, obsolete tank chassis fitted with captured Soviet 76.2mm guns or German 75mm Pak-40s. Effective but thinly armoured, vulnerable to return fire. Upgunned Panzer IV Ausf. F2, fitted with the long-barreled 75mm KWK-40, finally capable of defeating T-34s at range. This was the first German tank that could meet the Soviet machine on near equal terms. 88mm flak, increasingly standardized as an anti-tank weapon, though never available in sufficient numbers at the tactical front. These measures stabilized the battlefield in places, but they could not match the Soviets' growing flood of T-34s. By mid-1942, Soviet factories had achieved what German intelligence had dismissed as impossible: mass production of modern tanks. Where Germany built tanks in the thousands, the USSR built them in the tens of thousands. Production figures tell the story. Germany, 1942. Approximately 4,200 tanks of all types. Soviet Union, 1942. Approximately 24,000 tanks, including over 12,500 T-34s. These numbers come from post-war Allied translator and interpreter Section A TIS compilations, confirmed by Soviet archival records. Quality often suffered. T-34s of 1942 were crudely finished, with poor optics and unreliable transmissions. But the philosophy was different. As one Soviet factory manager put it, "Quantity has a quality of its own." A flawed tank in the field today was worth more than a perfect tank in 2 years' time. The industrial race played out dramatically at Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942. The city itself was a major industrial hub, home to the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, which produced T-34s. During the battle, tanks rolled straight from assembly lines into combat, sometimes without paint or even gun sights. Crews were formed from factory workers, many of them women. German accounts describe the shock of fighting brand-new tanks within the ruins of the factory complex. Panzer Grenadier veteran Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote in his diary, "The Russians roll out tanks as if from a magician's hat. We destroy one, and another comes, fresh from the workshops behind the walls of the city." This was the materialization of the Soviet strategy, to overwhelm German technical precision with brute industrial force. Hitler, increasingly fixated on miracle weapons, pushed for ever more complex designs. In 1942, he approved development of the Tiger heavy tank, a 57-ton behemoth armed with the 88mm KWK 36 gun. Its armour was nearly impenetrable, its gun deadly against the T-34. But production was agonizingly slow. Only a handful of Tigers reached the front in late 1942. Mechanical problems plagued them. While impressive on paper, they were too few to alter the balance. The Panther project, intended as Germany's true answer to the T-34, remained mired in prototypes and design disputes. It would not be ready until the following year. By the end of 1942, the lines were clear. The Soviet Union prioritized mass production of a single effective design, the T-34, supported by immense sacrifice and decentralized factories. Germany pursued multiple designs, slow development and boutique engineering that produced powerful machines but in tiny numbers. The Wehrmacht remained tactically formidable, but strategically the tide was turning. The T-34 ensured that the Red Army could replace its losses faster than Germany could destroy them. The industrial race of 1942 foreshadowed the decisive battles to come. At Kursk in 1943, thousands of T-34s would face the debut of the Panther and massed Tigers. But the outcome of that clash was already shaped by what had been decided in 1942. The Soviets could build more tanks than Germany could ever hope to match. For German crews on the Eastern Front, this meant the nightmare continued. Even as their weapons improved, they faced an enemy whose tanks never seemed to diminish, whose factories could outlast the Reich. The T-34 was no longer a surprise. It was the new normal, and the Wehrmacht was forced into a race it could not win. By the summer of 1943, the industrial race between Germany and the Soviet Union reached its peak. The Wehrmacht, desperate to regain the initiative after Stalingrad, prepared a massive armoured assault against the Kursk salient. It would be the largest tank battle in history, a test not only of strategy but of design, the debut of Germany's new Panther and massed Tiger tanks against the Soviet T-34. The result would decide whether Germany could ever reclaim the momentum it had lost. In April 1943, Hitler convened his generals at the Wolf's Lair. Intelligence confirmed that the Red Army had entrenched in a great bulge around Kursk. The plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, envisioned a pincer attack by Army Groups Centre and South, trapping Soviet forces. The operation was delayed repeatedly as Hitler insisted on waiting for new weapons. The Panzer Divisions would enter the battle with the long-awaited Panther alongside the Tiger and improved Panzer IVs. To Hitler, these machines promised restoration of armoured supremacy. But each delay gave the Soviets time to prepare. By July, they had built one of the most formidable defensive systems of the war, 3,000 miles of trenches, 400,000 mines, and thousands of anti-tank guns. Behind these fortifications stood the Red Army's armoured reserve, dominated by T-34s. The battlefield would bring together the most advanced tanks of the age. Panther Ausfests D, 44 tons, sloped armour inspired by the T-34, and a deadly 75mm KWK-42 gun capable of piercing a T-34 at over 1,500 metres. Tiger I, 57 tons, armed with the 88mm KWK-36, nearly impervious to Soviet guns at long range. T-34/76 Model 1943. Lighter, faster, easier to repair, but outgunned in direct duels. On paper, the German machines were superior. In reality, mechanical reliability and numbers told a different story. Panthers rushed to the front suffered crippling breakdowns. Of 200 committed by Army Group South, nearly half were disabled before the battle even began. The T-34, though technically inferior, was available in the thousands. Soviet production ensured that for every German tank, several T-34s could be fielded. On July 5, 1943, German forces launched their assault. The opening days saw fierce clashes on the northern and southern shoulders of the salient. At the village of Ponieri in the north, Tigers rolled forward against dug-in Soviet defences, smashing bunkers but bogging down under artillery fire. In the south, near Prokhorovka, the SS Panzer Corps advanced with Tigers and Panthers. Here, on July 12th, occurred the most famous tank clash of the war, the Battle of Prokhorovka. Eyewitnesses recall a scene of chaos. Soviet T-34s charged headlong into German lines, often closing the distance to 200 metres or less, where their 76mm guns had some chance against Tiger armour. German commanders were stunned by the ferocity. SS Untersturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop later remembered, "We saw waves of Russian tanks emerging from the morning mist. They came at us without hesitation, firing as they advanced. We destroyed them in scores, but still they came." The battlefield became a furnace of steel and fire. The battle revealed the essence of the industrial race. German tanks inflicted devastating losses. Soviet records admit that at Prokhorovka alone, more than 300 T-34s were destroyed in a single day. Yet the Germans could not achieve breakthrough. Mechanical failures crippled their Panthers, while the sheer weight of Soviet reserves blunted their advances. For every T-34 lost, another rolled forward from the rear. The Red Army accepted staggering casualties, confident that its factories could replenish them faster than Germany could. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, could not replace every lost Panther or Tiger. Each loss was irreplaceable, each mechanical breakdown a blow to operational strength. Soviet commanders adapted their tactics to compensate for the T-34's technical inferiority. Instead of meeting Tigers in open duels, they swarmed them, attacking from multiple directions. Infantry supported tanks with close assault tactics, planting mines or Molotov cocktails. Artillery laid dense barrages on German assembly areas. At Prokhorovka, Soviet tankers deliberately closed the distance, negating the long-range advantage of German guns. Survivors recalled the sheer terror of charging Tigers head-on. One veteran later said in a 1962 Veterans Symposium, "We knew we would lose many, but we also knew our tanks were simple, replaceable. If even one of us reached the German lines, it was worth it." By mid-July, the German offensive stalled. Soviet counterattacks surged across the front. At the same time, the Allies had landed in Sicily, forcing Hitler to divert forces west. Operation Citadel was cancelled. The Battle of Kursk ended with catastrophic German losses, nearly 1,500 tanks destroyed or disabled. The Soviets lost far more, estimates range from 6,000 to 7,000 tanks. But crucially, they could replace them. By the autumn, Soviet armoured strength had grown again, while Germany's dwindled. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently. Kursk marked the last major German offensive in the east. From then on, the Red Army would advance, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin. Post-battle reports reveal bitter disillusionment. Heinz Guderian, reinstated as Inspector of Armoured Troops, remarked bluntly, "We had overestimated the effect of our new weapons." The Panther, rushed into service, was not yet mature. The Tiger, though strong, was too few in number. Against the T-34, the decisive factor was not quality, but quantity. Letters from tank crews echo the sentiment. One Panzer officer wrote in July 1943, "Our tanks are magnificent, but they break down, and there are never enough. The Russians throw T-34s at us without end. It is like fighting the sea itself." For the Soviets, Kursk was proof that the T-34 had achieved its ultimate purpose, to serve as the backbone of an army that could not only survive but advance. Within months, production shifted to the improved T-34/85, armed with an 85mm gun capable of dueling Tigers on more equal terms. For Germany, the dream of regaining armoured supremacy was over. The Panther would mature into a formidable weapon, but it would never exist in numbers sufficient to counter the torrent of T-34s. The Tiger, meanwhile, became a symbol of technological brilliance undermined by strategic futility. The clash at Kursk confirmed what had begun at Mtsensk in 1941. German crews could no longer expect to outmatch Soviet tanks in numbers or adaptability. The T-34, by virtue of design and production, had shifted the balance of the war. In the words of a Soviet officer, recorded in 1945, "The Germans built perfect machines. We built machines that won the war." The shock of Kursk lingered on both sides. For Germany, the failure of Operation Citadel signalled that armoured supremacy, once the Wehrmacht's guarantee of victory, was slipping away. For the Soviet Union, the battle confirmed that numbers alone were not enough. Thousands of T-34s/76 had been lost, sometimes in brutal charges against Tigers and Panthers. The Red Army needed not only mass, but firepower capable of duelling the new German beasts. The answer arrived in late 1943, the T-34/85, a tank that would become the symbol of Soviet victory. The genesis of the T-34/85 came from urgent battlefield reports. Soviet tankers had complained bitterly that their 76.2mm guns were useless against Tigers except at suicidal ranges. At Kursk, even when Soviet crews closed within 500 meters, shells often bounced off thick frontal armor. Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself pressed Stalin, arguing that without a more powerful gun, the Red Army risked falling behind once again. The solution was the 85mm ZIS S-53 cannon, mounted in a new enlarged three-man turret. Unlike the cramped T-34/76 turret, which forced the commander to double as gunner, the T-34/85 allowed the commander to focus solely on commanding. Armour thickness was increased up to 75mm on the hull front and 90mm on the turret, providing a chance of surviving direct hits from the long-barrelled Panzer IV and even the Panther at medium ranges. By late 1943, prototypes were tested at the Gorokovets proving grounds. Stalin himself inspected the tank, reportedly running his hands along the sloped armour before approving mass production. By January 1944, the first T-34/85s rolled off the assembly lines at factory number 183 in Nizhny Tagil. The T-34/85 debuted in combat during the spring of 1944, just as the Red Army launched a series of massive offensives to push the Germans out of Ukraine. At Korsun and later in Operation Bagration, the new tanks proved their worth. Eyewitness accounts describe the psychological shift. German tank crews, accustomed to dominating duels, suddenly faced Soviet tanks that could penetrate their armour at 1,000 meters. A Panther commander captured near Minsk admitted during interrogation, "For the first time, we felt hunted." the T-34/85 could meet us on equal terms. Our long-range advantage was gone. Reports from the 13th Army's tank brigades noted that T-34s/85s could knock out Tigers at side angles from 800 to 1,000 meters, and even frontal penetrations were possible at closer range with sub-caliber ammunition. For the Soviet crews, long accustomed to desperation charges, this was liberation. They could now fight, not just sacrifice. By mid-1944, Soviet industry was producing 1,200 T-34/85s per month. Unlike Germany, which struggled to build even 100 Panthers or Tigers monthly, the Soviet Union ensured overwhelming numerical superiority. By war's end, over 22,000 T-34/85s had been produced. Factories achieved this by standardizing parts, simplifying welding, and using modular assembly. One Western observer, part of the US military mission to Moscow, marveled. Their factories look crude compared to Detroit, but they build tanks like bakers make bread. One batch after another, day and night, without pause. The result was a relentless stream of tanks moving westward on endless trains, replenishing every loss, feeding every offensive. The decisive test came in Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944 against German Army Group Center. Soviet armored spearheads, equipped with hundreds of T-34/85s, punched through weakly held sectors and raced deep into Belorussia. Villages that had once seen Panzers in 1941 now watched T-34/85s thunder through in reverse conquest. German reports speak of despair. A Wehrmacht officer recorded in July 1944, "Our Panthers are deadly, but there are too few and they break down constantly. The Russians come in waves of these new T-34s. Even when we destroy dozens, more arrive. We cannot kill them all." By August, Army Group Center was annihilated. The road to Warsaw lay open. As the Red Army advanced to the Vistula River, the T-34/85 became ubiquitous. German soldiers came to dread its silhouette. Though still vulnerable to the Tiger II, the massive King Tiger armed with an 88mm KWK-43, these monsters were rare. The reality of the battlefield was that the T-34/85 fought primarily against Panzer IVs, Stu Gs, and dwindling numbers of Panthers. Captured German diaries reflect growing resignation. The T-34/85 is everywhere. Our anti-tank guns no longer guarantee kills. The Russians are learning, they flank, they coordinate, they overwhelm. It feels like 1941 in reverse. By early 1945, as the Vistula-Oder offensive began, whole Soviet tank armies surged forward with T-34/85s at the core. In just 2 weeks, they advanced nearly 300 miles to the Oder River, an operational tempo the Germans could not match. The final chapter unfolded in April 1945. As Zhukov's first Belarusian front and Konev's first Ukrainian front converged on Berlin, the T-34/85 led the assault. Street by street, the tanks battered through barricades, their 85mm guns blasting bunkers and strongpoints. German civilians and soldiers alike were stunned by the sheer scale. In Berlin, over 3,000 Soviet tanks, most of them T-34/85s, fought house to house. German defenders fielded the last of their Tigers and Panthers, but fuel shortages and urban terrain negated their advantages. A Soviet tanker later recalled in a 1985 veterans reunion, "In the ruins, the mighty Tiger was just a big target. Our T-34s/85s could outmaneuver them among the rubble. We fired point blank. It was brutal, but it ended the war." On May 2, 1945, Berlin fell. T-34/85 SS stood in the Reichstag's shadow, their turrets still smoking, the symbol of the Soviet victory. The T-34/85 was not the best tank of the war in any single category. It was not as powerful as the Tiger II, not as precise as the Panther, not as comfortable as the Sherman. But it was enough. Enough firepower to kill, enough armour to survive, enough numbers to overwhelm. And unlike its German rivals, it never ceased arriving in endless waves. Post-war, the T-34/85 became the backbone of Soviet influence. From Prague to Pyongyang, from Hanoi to Havana, it served in dozens of armies. German veterans who had once fought it in despair lived to see it dominate Cold War battlefields. One former Panzer officer interviewed in 1962 admitted, "We thought of ourselves as the best tank soldiers in the world. But in the end, we lost to a machine that was simple, rugged, and always there." The T-34/85 was not brilliant. It was inevitable. The journey that began at Mtsensk in 1941 ended in Berlin in 1945. German tank crews, who once laughed at the crude Soviet designs, were forced to surrender before thousands of T-34/85s. The myth of German superiority had been shattered by Soviet pragmatism and industrial will. The last word belongs to a Soviet veteran, whose memoir captured the essence. "The Germans built marvels. We built victory. The T-34/85 was our answer to everything they had, and it carried us all the way to Berlin." The T-34's story did not end in the ruins of Berlin. Its journey from the shock of Mtsensk in 1941 to the triumphant surge across Europe by 1945 left scars, myths, and lessons that would echo across generations. To the Germans who faced it, the T-34 became a spectre of inevitability. To Soviet tankers, it was both a coffin and a saviour. To the post-war world, it was a symbol, crude, rugged, but unstoppable, of industrial warfare's logic. German officers who survived the Eastern Front were consistent in their recollections. The T-34 changed everything. Heinz Guderian, whose spearhead had first collided with the tank near Mtsensk, later admitted in his memoirs, "Our Panzer III and IV were no match for it. The T-34 was faster, better armed, and its armour deflected our guns. It forced us to rethink our entire armoured doctrine." Captured German diaries repeat the same refrain. Soldiers wrote of their frustration as 37mm and 50mm shells bounced harmlessly off sloped armour, of ambushes in mud where the Soviet tank glided while Panzers bogged down. A Tiger commander at Kursk confessed under interrogation in 1944, "Even when we destroyed them, there were always more." The T-34 was not a tank, it was a flood. The psychological effect was as important as the physical. By late 1942, German crews had lost the confidence that had carried them through Poland, France, and the opening stages of Barbarossa. They no longer assumed victory in tank battles, they assumed struggle. For Soviet crews, the T-34 was both beloved and feared. Survivability was relative. In 1941 to 42, crews spoke bitterly of being incinerated inside their tanks when German 88mm shells struck. A veteran from the 5th Guards Tank Army recalled, "We called it the coffin for four brothers, but we also knew without it there would be no victory. It gave us a chance, at least, where before there was none." That duality never faded. Even with the improved T-34/85, casualty rates remained horrific. Tankers often carried icons or painted slogans, "Za Rodinu," for the motherland, as if to remind themselves that survival was not guaranteed. Soviet propaganda elevated the T-34 into legend, but among the men who drove it, the memory was more complicated. It was both their grave and their weapon of vengeance. The T-34 also embodied a deeper truth about the war. In industrial conflict, simplicity often triumphs over brilliance. The German Panther was, by many measures, a superior tank, powerful, heavily armed, and lethal at range. The Tiger II was nearly impervious from the front, but they were fragile, expensive, and slow to produce. A Panther took 150,000 man-hours to build. A T-34 required barely 30,000. By the time Germany fielded a single Tiger, the Soviet Union produced 10 T-34s. Losses mattered less when replacements arrived by rail every week. The Red Army learned to rotate entire brigades out of action and replace them wholesale, a luxury the Wehrmacht never had. American observers after the war drew blunt conclusions. The US Strategic Bombing Survey noted, "The Germans pursued technical excellence at the expense of numbers. The Soviets pursued adequacy in overwhelming quantity. History shows which path proved decisive." When the war ended, the T-34 did not fade into museums. Instead, it became the backbone of Soviet power projection. In 1945 alone, over 12,000 remained operational. Stalin exported them to Warsaw Pact states, to China, to Korea. By the 1950s, the T-34/85 was fighting again, this time against American Shermans, Pershings, and Pattons in Korea. It served in the Middle East, in Vietnam, in Africa. By the 1970s, more than 50 countries still operated the T-34. Its longevity was extraordinary. Cuban T-34s rolled ashore at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. Angolan T-34s clashed with South African armoured cars in the 1970s. Even in the 1990s, T-34s appeared in Balkan conflicts, 4 decades after they had first roared into Berlin. For German veterans, this persistence was a grim reminder. They had faced a machine so numerous, so rugged, that it outlasted even the Reich that had once threatened Europe. The T-34's place in cultural memory was carefully cultivated. In the Soviet Union, it became the icon of the Great Patriotic War. Monuments across Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus display T-34s mounted on pedestals, their guns raised in eternal victory. Every May 9th, they roll again in parades, symbols of triumph and sacrifice. Western memory, however, often romanticized German tanks, the Tiger, the Panther, as symbols of engineering excellence. Yet even among German veterans, the grudging respect for the T-34 endured. During a 1962 symposium in West Germany, a former Panzer officer declared, "The Tiger may have been the king, but the T-34 was the wolf pack. The king dies when the pack surrounds him." The story had begun at Mtsensk, October 1941, when a stunned Guderian watched his vaunted Panzers falter before a handful of Soviet machines. It had ended in Berlin, April 1945, when those machines, evolved, multiplied, relentless, parked beneath the Reichstag's shattered dome. Between those bookends lies the central lesson. Wars are not won by marvels, but by machines that never stop coming. The T-34 was not perfect. It was not even the best in conventional terms. But it was the right balance at the right time, produced in the right numbers, by a nation willing to sacrifice everything. Its combination of sloped armour, adequate gun, and sheer mass shifted the balance of the Eastern Front. From 1942 onward, the Germans fought a war of attrition they could not win. In 1985, at a veterans' reunion in Moscow marking the 40th anniversary of victory, a Soviet tanker met his former enemy, a German panzer commander. They stood before a preserved T-34/85 in a museum courtyard. The German shook his head and said, "We thought we were better. We had better training, better machines, better doctrine. But this tank, it defeated us." The Soviet replied simply, "Not the tank. The people who built it, the people who drove it, the people who died in it. But yes, without the T-34, there would be no victory." And perhaps that is the final truth. The T-34 was more than steel and numbers. It was the material expression of Soviet will, the bridge between peasant factories and battlefield triumphs, the machine that turned disaster into deliverance. When visitors ask at museums why so many German tanks sit as shattered hulks, while T-34s remain perched on pedestals? The answer lies in history's arithmetic. Germany measured tanks by dozens. The Soviet Union measured by tens of thousands. And in the arithmetic of total war, the side with more fuel, more steel, more tanks, dictates the ending. The T-34 dictated the ending. From Mtsensk to Berlin, it wrote the story in mud, fire, and iron.